A very good evening to all of you. I welcome you all to the ICANN initiative, the Hindu and Indian Express analysis. So, we will start today with the topics. The first topic we are going to deal with today is about the public private partnership. So, this is one of the public private partnership, or PPP, is one of the mode of investment which you talk about in GS paper 3. So there is a specific topic under GS paper 3 about the different models of investment, which covers FDI, FPI, PPP and various models under PPP. So all of these, about all these you need to know. So it comes under your GS paper 3. So this whole article, this whole editorial was about analysis of the PPP, though the content was not so concrete or so specific to be written in the exam, but the topic per se is very important. So that's the reason why today I have decided to elaborate a little bit upon this topic. So now let's first have a look at some data. So our data says that India has nearly 1,200 PPP projects which are in operation, and that amounts to nearly 7 lakh crore of investment that is going into these 1,200 projects which are being now which are under progress under the PPP model. So this is the basic data that you must know regarding how many PPP projects are being undertaken in India. So to what extent PPP is popular in India. So this is the basic data that you need to know. You must also know that PPP has been there in existence, but since the 1990s, when the liberalization, privatization, globalization era has started, so since those LPG reforms, the PPP projects have increased a lot. So, however, these PPP projects in India have not taken up so successfully. That is because of the number of issues that these projects are facing. So, this could be from the issue related to the land acquisition, which is always delayed, to the public private partnership projects, or whether it is related to the environmental clearances that these projects do not often get, or it may be related to the protests by the inhabitants of the area where these projects are about to come up. So there is a lack of support from the people, or it could also be the cost overruns, that is purely because of the time that is taken or the delay that is involved in giving various clearances to the PPP projects. So there are time and cost overruns in these projects. Then there are issues related to the quality, that the substandard quality of performance under the PPP projects or any infrastructure being created under the PPP project, it is of a questionable quality. This is one more issue. And then is the risk allocation, which is again not properly done. So for example, if it is a construction of a road project under a PPP model of investment, so in such a case the agreement says that the private party will have to pay to the government depending upon the a certain amount of traffic flow in the road that is being built. But however, what is projected, the projected traffic is very much higher than the actual traffic. So these private entities do not even see that much amount of traffic on the roads to be able to collect the toll and pay a part of it to the government. So this is where the risk allocation also matters a lot, and some unwarranted risks are being allocated on the private entities. So this is one more issue. Next is the issue of funding. So our banking system is also suffering with the dual balance sheet syndromes. So therefore there are issues related to the non-performing assets, and the banks are not very much welcoming the PPP projects, or rather lending money to them. So these are several issues which the PPP projects in India are facing. So next, see, yes, so because there were a lot of issues that the PPP projects were facing, in 2015-16 government set up a committee under Vijay Kelkar to come out with recommendations on how the PPP projects in India could be revamped and how the PPP projects can be made to be successful. So this committee, apart from giving a lot of good recommendations, also proposed a basic definition of the public-private partnership. So let's first go through this definition, and then we'll also look at some of the important recommendations of the Vijay Kelkar committee. So, among the definition, the first thing the committee says is about in these projects, there is a private entity and there is a government or any body under the government. So, government is definitely there in picture in the PPP projects, and usually government is in the minority shareholding. So, this is the first condition. Second thing is, whenever PPP projects are being undertaken, it is for the public goods and services. So, this whole project, the collaboration of government and the private sector, is for the delivery of public goods and services. This is the second condition. Third is, these PPP projects, there is going to be a contract which is going to be for a definite time period, which is usually a medium term time period. So it is not that the PPP contract is going to extend indefinitely over the lifetime of somebody, but rather it is going to just be over a definite period of time. Next is that there is a contract between the government on the one hand and the private project concessionaire on the other hand, and the two will enter into a model concessionaire agreement. So there is going to be a contract which determines the exact conditions under which these PPP projects are to be carried out, what are the obligations of the government, what are the obligations of the private parties. All of these are going to be mentioned in this contract. The next is the revenue stream. That is, these public-private partnership projects are definitely projects which have to be commercially viable. So for that, if you want the private sector to participate enthusiastically in PPP projects, we have to make sure that they have a sustained revenue stream so that the project as a whole is economically viable. So these are the important components of the definition of PPP that was given by the Vijay Kelkar committee. Now let's go and have a look at some of the important recommendations made by the committee. So whenever you are asked a question about PPP, the question may be what is PPP, that is define public-private partnership, and also enlist the issues that are faced by the PPP projects in India. Why has the PPP model in India not taken off very successfully? So you may be asked to analyze the issues. And lastly, you may be asked to come out with some suggestions and recommendations as to how the PPP model can be revamped and how the projects can be made to be more successful. So this is where you will be using the Vijay Kelkar committee recommendations. So that you will be using in the way forward or in the methods or the recommendations that should be adopted for making the PPP model more viable. So the first thing the committee said was about so before this, the committee focused on three important things. So the committee said that if we want to have a strong PPP framework in India, then we should focus on three important things. One is the governance, second is the institutions, and third is the capacity. So these are the three important pillars of the PPP framework and which have to be strengthened if we want the entire PPP framework to work successfully. So therefore, the recommendations also focused on these three important areas. So first, we will have a look at what the committee said about the 3PI. Vijay Kelkar committee recommended that 3PI, that is 3P means public-private partnership, I is for Institute of Excellence. So a 3PI has to be set up which will help in capacity building related to the PPP projects. So this is an institutional reform which has to be done to give a strong institutional backing to the PPP projects in India. So it is a public-private partnership Institute of Excellence which has to be set up that will provide the institutional capacity building activities for strengthening the PPP projects in India. This was the first recommendation. Second was related to the amendment that has to be done to the Prevention of Corruption Act. So to just tell you briefly, Prevention of Corruption Act is very strict in terms of taking actions against public servants. So if a civil servant has to sign for undertaking any PPP project, and if that project later on fails or it doesn't turn out to be successful, then usually we assume that there is a collusive bribery, collusive corruption between the public servant and the private project concessionaire. So that is why the project went to a wrong person and eventually the PPP project did not take up or did not take off. But however, many times there is going to be some genuine mistakes that can happen on the part of the public servants. So usually because of the fear of prosecution under the Prevention of Corruption Act, the civil servants are very hesitant to take decisions in the cases of PPP projects. They don't end up taking decisions at all. In order to avoid this, what Vijay Kelkar committee has recommended is we need to amend the Prevention of Corruption Act, and then we need to allow for some of the genuine mistakes that the civil servants might have committed while granting some permissions to the private projects or PPP projects. So this is what the Vijay Kelkar committee says, that we need to amend the Prevention of Corruption Act. So that is the second thing that is said. Third recommendation is about the model concessionaire agreement. So as I said, whenever a PPP project is being proposed, there is going to be an agreement between the government and the project concessionaire. This agreement is called as a model concessionaire agreement. So this agreement lays down all the do's and don'ts and all the contractual obligations on part of both the government and the project concessionaire. So by when the project has to be completed, what is going to be the budget, what is going to be the quality, and what is the revenue sharing model between the government and the private. So everything is going to be mentioned in this model concessionaire agreement. So what Vijay Kelkar committee says is we need to stop having a one size fits all approach to the model concessionaire agreement. That is, there are PPP projects in different sectors work very differently. So PPP projects in roads are different from the ones in railways, are different from the ones in the social sectors like health and education. So therefore, we cannot have a one size fits all model concessionaire agreement. Rather, it has to be more flexible, that depends upon the particular field. So based on that, we have to design our MCA so that it is more flexible and it acknowledges the typical or the specific constraints of the respective fields. This was a third recommendation. Next is about the extension of the PPP model. Now the PPP model is more restricted to the infrastructure projects, be it the airports or railway lines or expressways and other roads. So what Vijay Kelkar committee says is that once these things mature, we need to extend the PPP model even to the social sectors like be it the field of health and even urban transportation. These are some of the areas where we can extend the PPP model later on. So this is the fourth recommendation. The next is about the law or having a legislative framework. So even though we have 1200 PPP projects now under operation in India, we still do not have a particular PPP policy or any law specifically for public-private partnership. So what Vijay Kelkar committee says is that the parliament has to come out with a law for the PPP projects, which provides an authoritative legislative backing for the PPP projects in India. So once it comes as a law through the parliament, all the projects and whatever is being done under PPP will automatically can be questioned in the parliament, and it automatically becomes accountable to the parliament. So that way we can also prevent chances of corruption in the PPP projects, and also there is going to be an authoritative legislative framework for all the PPP projects in India. So this was another recommendation. And the next is about the important committees which the Vijay Kelkar committee has recommended to be set up. One of these committee is about the Infrastructure PPP Project Review Committee. So why is this committee important? Many times when PPP projects are started, after some period of time we see that these projects are stressed out. Either the model is not working, they don't have funds. There can be so many reasons why these PPP projects get stressed out. So there has to be a project review committee which is going to go through the extent, or which is going to go through the progress of the PPP projects and then assess whether this PPP project is bound to fail and therefore it should be abandoned, or should it be given some additional support so that it can kick off. So this project review committee is basically going to assess the PPP project after some point of time and then decide what has to be done to the stressed PPP projects. The another committee which Vijay Kelkar recommended was about the setting up of an PPP adjudicatory committee. So this is like a tribunal, and it is going to help in grievance redressal between the government and the private project concessionaire. So whatever issue is there, this tribunal can handle all the grievances and all the disputes related to that particular project. So these are the various important recommendations of the Vijay Kelkar committee. There are other recommendations, there will be several recommendations, but let us limit it to the few most important ones which you can actually replicate in the exam. So don't run behind exhaustive collection of all the recommendations of a particular committee. You have to know a few important ones which you can actually quote in the exam. Now, even if you know 20 recommendations of this committee, you will neither have time nor do you have space in the exam to quote everything, nor is it important also. So therefore, just limit yourself to some minimum number so that you can quote and write a very good answer. So this is about the recommendations. So today I have discussed about the data related to PPP committee, and then some of the issues, and then what the Vijay Kelkar committee recommendations have been, and what is the definition of the PPP. Next is about the Niti Aayog. Niti Aayog had come out with this document, Strategy for New India at 75. So in this document, Niti Aayog points out that the private investment in India, the investment rate in 2017-18 was just at 28%. So this, the Niti Aayog wants to increase it by 2022-23 to 36%. So if we want the private investment in the economy to be boosted, then public-private partnership is one of the best models through which the private investment rate can be boosted. So this is one precise reason why we must promote and encourage PPP projects, and we must also create a conducive environment and encourage the private participants to come in and partner with the government in the PPP projects. So this whole thing gives you, I feel, a very good picture about the PPP projects and the various issues associated with what recommendations can be given to make it more successful. So now we move on to the next topic. The next topic we'll be talking about is about the Assisted Reproductive Technology Bill 2020. So analysis of the various bills and legislations of the government is a part of your GS2 syllabus, so it comes under your GS2 paper. So this whole article was dedicated to analyzing this ART Bill 2020. So it provides a critical analysis of this bill. It points out some of the important issues that or the concerns that this bill is now posing. So let's discuss this in more detail. So first of all, the objective of the bill is threefold. So first objective is there are so many ART clinics or ART banks which have mushroomed, and many of them have not been even registered or licensed. So these clinics end up exploiting a lot of poor, illiterate or unaware, uneducated women. So in order to ensure that these ART banks and ART clinics are regulated, it's important for us to have a legislative backing. So this law provides for regulation of all the ART clinics and the ART banks. The second is about the safety and the ethics. So this ART is a particular technology which has to be done in a process which has to be followed strictly. Otherwise, it can become very unsafe for the person who is donating the egg, and also the person in whom the egg is getting or the embryo is getting implanted. So there are a lot of ethical issues which are involved and safety issues which are involved, and therefore the bill is also concerned about the safety and the ethics that is involved in the entire process. The third, as I said, that a lot of ART clinics have mushroomed which are exploiting the unawareness or women who are uneducated about it, and they are being misused in these ART clinics. So the aim of the bill is also to prevent the exploitation of women and children. So these are the threefold objectives of this legislation. So now let's understand the importance of this legislation. There are nearly 27 million infertile Indian couples. So for these infertile Indian couples, ART, this technology is like a boon for them, because even in spite of being infertile, they can dream of having a baby of their own, a child of their own. So this is possible only because of the assisted reproductive technology that is available. So this is the importance that such huge number of people in India are infertile couples, and they can now dream of having a baby of their own. So that is the importance of assisted reproductive technology, and therefore that is the importance of this particular legislation. So this has to be the fundamental, has to be very clear. Why are we introducing this bill? What is the importance and what is the threefold objective? Now let's look at some of the concerns that this bill is now throwing up. The first is who can access the assisted reproductive technology, all the services, who can access. The bill says that the services can be accessed by people who are married heterosexuals, or it can be women who are above the age of marriage. So they can have access to the ART. But however, those who cannot have access to ART includes the LGBTQ community, includes single men, it includes people who are just cohabiting with each other, the heterosexual couples who are cohabiting with each other, that is nothing but the live-in relationships. Or it could also be the single men is done, LGBTQ community is done, then those who are just in the live-in relationship without any marriage. So these are the people for whom ART is not applicable. So these people are being discriminated against in the bill, in the fact that they are not eligible for having access to the assisted reproductive technology services. So this has been discriminatory because one thing, it violates Article 14 of the Constitution that talks about the right to equality. Everybody is equal in the eyes of the law. Law is supreme and everybody else is equal in the eyes of the law. So this article is being violated because it is treating people who are married and women above the age of marriage very differently compared to the treatment that is given to the LGBTQ and also the single men and people, heterosexual couples who are just cohabiting together. So there is a lot of discrimination that is going on. Now whenever you are writing this argument or this point about the concerns in the bill, you have to quote judgment, and the name of this judgment is Navtej Johar. Now you have to write in the comment section what Navtej Johar judgment is about. So I had asked this couple of days before also, so let's revise it together. So post in the comment section why is it that you have to mention Navtej Johar in this particular point. So what was the judgment about? So this is about the first concern, that it is kind of discriminatory against these set of people and is therefore violating Article 14 of the Constitution. Now let's look at the second issue. It is about the protection of the egg donors. So what happens in ART is the couple is infertile, so therefore they will need some egg donors. So some women come forward and they donate their eggs, and this egg is then made into an embryo, and this embryo is later on implanted into the womb of the infertile mother. So this is the whole process. What happens in this whole process is this process involves a lot of techniques which have to be done to ensure the safety of the egg donors. This whole bill talks about the infertile couples and all the safety procedures, etc. But however, it is not offering protection to the donors of the eggs. So it is not talking about any counseling that must be done to those people who are donating the eggs. There is no provision for counseling. And also, if once a woman gives her consent to donating the eggs, she cannot withdraw. There is no provision in the bill, in this bill, to withdraw the consent that has once been given for donating the eggs. So these are some of the issues about the protection of the egg donors which is lacking. So this is, and also the third issue related to the egg donors is, whenever a person has to donate her eggs, then she will have to, that involves a particular procedure which has to be undertaken. So she will be losing that day's work, that day's salary, the time, effort, everything is going to be put into that process. But however, she is not going to receive any reimbursement or any kind of compensation for donating the egg. So this is very important, that there is no compensation that is being given to the egg donors for the loss they suffer in the salary, time and effort. So these are the 3 points which show that this bill is not actually having provisions to protect the egg donors. So protection of the egg donors is not being emphasized or ensured in this particular bill. This is the second important issue. Move on to the third issue, which is about the gene testing. So this bill says that whenever the embryo is formed after the donation of the egg and after fusing it with the sperm, an embryo is formed, and this embryo is going to be tested for its genetic formation. So if it is found that this embryo has some faulty genes, then this particular embryo is going to be given for or donated for some research. So faulty genes means what? So if it is found by genetic testing that the particular embryo is more prone to some inheritable diseases, is more prone to some genetic mutations or life-threatening diseases, then such embryo is not going to be implanted in the womb of the mother. Rather, it is going to be donated to some research purpose. Now here the problem arises because the bill does not say under what conditions the embryo can be donated to research purpose. That is, it does not say what are those kind of disorders through which, if that is present, then the embryo can be donated to research. If this is not clearly mentioned in the bill, that is, what are the kind of disorders, if it is found in the genes, if it is found in the embryo, then it need not be implanted. If this is not clear, then what happens is people will go for very selective embryos that are being implanted into the mother. So even if a small minor thing is there, then there is a chance that the infertile couple could just reject the embryo, just because, let's say, through genetic testing it comes out that the baby is going to have dark skin or is not going to have a great height. Then the parents may just say that let us donate it for research purpose. So what are those kinds of disorders which will guarantee the donation to research purpose and not implantation? That is not clearly mentioned in the bill. This has to be done, otherwise this will promote what is called as eugenics. So many of you must be knowing what eugenics is. Eugenics is nothing but deliberately and consciously selecting the genes which have some superior qualities. So this is against the law of the nature. So you are consciously selecting the kind of babies that have to be born. So eugenics is actually illegal, it is unlawful, and it's not permissible. So if this bill is not talking about the what kind of disorders in which case the embryo can be donated for research, then it will indirectly lead to eugenics, which is actually illegal and not permissible. So this is the third important issue that is associated with the bill. Next is about the ambiguity. This bill has a number of terms, like for example infertility, or it can be who is a couple, or what is an ART clinic, what is an ART bank. So these are some of the terms which are not defined in the ART bill, but rather some of them are defined in the Surrogacy Regulation Bill of 2019. So this particular act does not give a proper definition of these important terms which are used at a lot of places in the particular bill. So this creates a lot of ambiguity as to the bill is making a mention of so many words, but then these words are not being properly unambiguously defined in the ART 2020 bill. So this is the next issue. The last issue is about the varied regulation. So if you compare the ART Bill 2020 with the Surrogacy Regulation Bill 2019, these two bills are supposed to be more supplementary to each other, but then there are varied regulations that are there for the same kind of offense. Now, for example, offences under the ART bill are bailable, but offences under the Surrogacy Regulation Bill are not bailable. In ART, the records have to be maintained for 10 years, whereas in the Surrogacy Regulation Bill, the records have to be maintained for 25 years. Also, for the same kind of offense, the punishment that is offered in ART and SRB are different. SRB is more stringent and it offers more punishment, but the same offense under ART is offering lesser punishment. So therefore, the same kind of thing is being treated differently under different laws. So this is amounting to varied regulation, and if the same actions are taken by the surrogacy clinic and the ART clinic, and if they attract varied regulation, then definitely it is a cause of concern. So these are the 5 important issues that has now been pointed out of this ART bill 2020. So this is the analysis about this particular bill. Now let's move on to the next topic. The last topic we'll be discussing is about the gene editing. So this definitely comes under your science and technology syllabus. So it comes under your GS paper 3. So the reason this can be a very hot topic and it can come as a question in this year mains is because the chemistry Nobel Prize has gone to two women scientists, Emmanuel Carpentier and Jennifer, who have done their work on CRISPR-Cas9, which is actually a gene editing tool. So it is used to edit parts of the DNA and then fix up whatever has gone wrong. So this is a tool that is used to edit our genes. As such, gene editing technology is therefore very much in news because of the chemistry Nobel, and you can expect a full-fledged question on this topic. So, and also you can use the same example if you are writing an essay on women empowerment. So this is the first time that any Nobel Prize has been given to a team of two women scientists. So this is the first time that has happened. So you can quote this as an example to show how women can make their presence felt and what the extent of contributions that they can make in various fields, and they can stand out and excel in various fields which are considered to be very difficult and challenging. So this can be used as an example in that case also. And so because gene editing is very much in use, we must understand that gene editing is very important. Why there is so much of research behind it, that the scientists have went on to win a Nobel Prize. It is because the technology has a lot of potential to cure several diseases. So this technology can help us treat diseases. For example, if many of the diseases happen because of some genetic mutations, it could be cancers. So this gene editing technique can help us in curing these diseases which are inherited by all the genetic diseases. If there is a faulty gene, the gene editing technique could be used to set that right. So that is one thing, and it can be used in the treatment of cancers. So therefore gene editing as a technology has a lot of importance and potential to treat various deadly life-threatening human diseases. The second is the importance that this technology has in the field of agriculture. So now there is an understanding among the scientific community that the gene editing tool should not be used over human embryos, but rather it is used very much widely in the field of agriculture. So the gene editing is used to make the seeds more disease resistant, more pest resistant, more water, that they can take up just a little water and they can live and they can thrive, and they can be weed or herbicide resistant. So like that, seeds which are of superior quality, which can take a lot of water stress and temperature stress. So such superior types of seeds are now being made through the help of these gene editing technologies. So that is how it is very much used in the field of agriculture. Given that climate change is already there amongst us, so in the future agriculture as a field is going to feel more threat and pressure. So these gene editing techniques can really help us to increase the quality and quantity of our produce, and to also prevent from the pest attacks, and to also make sure that they are drought resistant, pest resistant, and all that. So this is the use of gene editing as a technology in the field of agriculture. But however, there are several issues that are involved. One is a eugenics that I just explained in the previous topic. So once you have the capability to edit some of the genes, you will beforehand you will do gene testing, and if you see that some of the things are not right, then you will immediately go on to gene editing, and then you will say that this is how I want the genes to be, and then there is going to be gene editing. So this will end up like what is called as the trait shopping. So you will see these are the traits that I want to be in my child, and you will shop for those traits, you will pay the money, and somebody is going to edit the genes for you. So this can happen, this can lead to eugenics, which is a very ethical concern. So in this regard, you have to quote an example which is about a Chinese researcher. So what he started to do was he was trying to edit the genes in the human embryos, so that the children born out of those embryos are resistant to HIV infections. So this, however, brought in a lot of international furor, and for later on it was stopped. But however, these are the ways through which this whole process, this whole technology could be misused and abused. So you can quote this example, and you can say that how this gene editing can also lead to eugenics. So this is one important issue related to the gene editing as a technology. So that is it for today. The other articles that weren't important from the exam point of view, or which have the content has been repeated before earlier. And also today on my channel Prerayati, I have posted a video about this strategy. It's a complete guide for your mains 2020 exam on what exactly I did. So you can go through that video to get some help and get a direction as to how we need to start and what we need to do to score really well in your mains exam. So that's it for today. Thank you.